Scientists have long recognized the incredible diversity within a species. Okay, so we're talking about diversity not across species but within a species. Just get my pen working here. All right. But then they thought it reflected evolutionary changes that unfolded imperceptibly. Imperceptibly is not noticeably, like in very minute changes that happen over a over a period of time. Right, that's imperceptibly. Now here's a clue that you can pick from the passage. If I said, I used to think the cat was easy, right? I'm saying I used to think the cat was easy in the past tense, which means I don't think it anymore, which means now I think that the cat is not easy, that it is probably difficult. That's a parallel example. The point I'm trying to make here is this sentence says they thought it reflected evolutionary changes that happen. So the reason for diversity, they thought initially that the diversity was because of evolutionary changes, taught in the past tense, which means they don't think it anymore. And that gives you a good hint of what the passage is going to be about. Because that already tells you that there are two theories, an old theory and possibly a new theory. It's not just evolutionary changes or it's not evolutionary changes. Something like that is going to happen in this passage. And when the passage is only 1 to 3 paragraphs long, and you already have an indication that there are like two possible sides to an issue that we're talking about, an old theory versus a new theory, it is unlikely that there is going to be anything else happening in the passage. When a passage is 5 or 6 paragraphs long, which is unlikely that you would see such a long passage, there are lots of directional changes that can happen within the passage. Each paragraph can be a small shift in the topic. But with just 2 or 3 paragraphs, sometimes passages such as 1 paragraph, there aren't too many shifts that can happen. And you already know that there are two sides talked about. So when you read something like this, look for such hints when you're reading the passage. That will give you a really strong indication of what's happening. If you already have a good guess about what's happening in the passage, when you're actually reading it, processing the information and learning from it and understanding it and then answering your questions becomes a lot easier. So this is something that you can practice when you are working on RC right now, not just in the test. So look for such hints on where the direction is and what the author is going to say next. I'm going to go ahead and continue reading. That divergence between populations within a species was enforced according to Ernst Mayr. So we're introduced to a guy called Ernst Mayr. Let's call him EM in our notes. The great evolutionary biologist of the 1940s. When a population was separated from the rest of the species by a mountain range or a desert. Okay, so evolutionary changes happened or diversity happened when there was a physical separation, like with a mountain range or a desert, preventing breeding across the divide over geological scales of time. Sometimes this is another tip for you. When it's a long sentence or there is a methodology or a process or a scientific theory that is explained, it works for me personally if I can give a quick example to myself, right? So there was the Himalaya separated animals into India and China, and they became two different species. So something, if you can think of quickly, don't waste time trying to think of an example. So there's a physical divide, and because of that physical divide, this population had divergences. Without the separation, gene flow was relentless. So when there is separation, then there is diversity. When there is no separation, then there is relentless gene flow, which means gene flow continues to happen, which means the species continues to kind of be the same. But as the separation persisted, the isolated population grew apart and speciation occurred. Speciation is basically the creation of a species. But you don't have to know that because that's kind of explained in the paragraph. In the mid-1960s, the biologist Paul Ehrlich, so now you're introduced to another guy. So possibly, notice that he was popular in the 1940s and now you're talking about the 1960s. So that clearly supports our idea of an old theory versus a new theory. So now you're talking about the theory change, right? So this guy, who's the new theory guy, is Paul Ehrlich, author of The Population Bomb, and his Stanford University colleague, Peter Raven. So you have two guys, right? Let's just call them E and R. Right? They challenged Mayer's ideas about speciation. So they had a different theory. They had studied checker spot butterflies living in the Jasper Ridge Biological Preserve in California, and it soon became clear that they were not examining a single population. Now, the interesting thing is they are looking at one area, right, just within the biological preserve, and they are saying it was not a single population, which is probably why they are challenging it, because here you need physical separation across multiple places. Through years of capturing, marking, and then recapturing the butterflies, they were able to prove that within the population, spread over just 50 acres of suitable checker spot habitat, there were three groups that rarely interacted despite their close proximity. So, no need for separation. It seems to be the point that these guys are making. Whereas Mayer's theory was that you need separation. Let's continue reading the passage. Among other ideas, Ehrlich and Raven, so ENR again, we're continuing to talk about them, argued in a now classic paper from 1969 that gene flow was not as predictable and ubiquitous as Mayer and his cohort maintained. If you go back to what we talked about gene flow, when there is no separation, then gene flow continues to happen, always happen, right? The words that he used was that gene flow was relentless, right? It continues to happen. That's Mayer's theory. Now he's saying it's not as ubiquitous. Ubiquitous is like present everywhere, so it's not that common is what they are saying, right? It's not as predictable. It doesn't always happen. So he's talking about gene flow, and thus evolutionary divergence between neighboring groups in a population was probably common. They also asserted that isolation and gene flow were less important. So, isolation was less important to evolutionary divergence than natural selection. So, now we know their theory, and their theory is it's because of natural selection. And it's giving you what those factors are. What does natural selection constitute? When factors such as mate choice, weather, disease, or predation cause better adapted individuals to survive and pass on their successful genetic traits. So the first theory, Mayer's theory, is physical separation, and Ehrlich and Raven's theory is natural selection is more important, right? They're not saying natural selection is the only factor, which is something you need to pay attention to. They are basically saying that isolation and gene flow were less important. That's the words that they have used, which means they are not questioning whether they are a factor, they're questioning it's not the central factor. For example, Ehrlich and Raven suggested that without the force of natural selection, an isolated population would remain unchanged, and that in other scenarios, natural selection could be strong enough to overpower gene flow, which is kind of like re-establishing their point. So now we know what's happening in the passage. We're talking about the evolution of a species, and there are two sides here. The old theory posited by Mayer is that physical separation is the best way to, is probably the reason for diversification and evolution in a species. And then the second group of guys are saying that it, more than physical separation and gene flow, it is about natural selection. All right, let's look at the questions. Which of the following best sums up Ehrlich and Raven's argument in their classic 1969 paper? Now, if you notice in the passage, we talked about Ehrlich and Raven in two paragraphs. In the second one and the third one. In the second one, we talked about this butterfly experiment. And then in the third one, which starts off by saying, Ehrlich and Raven argued in a now classic paper from 1969. So this passage, this question references the third paragraph in the passage, which means if you have an option that is exclusive to the second paragraph, that may not necessarily be the answer. Let's look at our options and then do the process of elimination. Ernst Mayr was wrong in identifying physical separation as the cause for species diversity. Now we talked about how they are saying that physical separation was less important. So they never said that Mayr was wrong in saying this was the cause. They're saying Mayr was wrong in saying this was the sole or the predominant cause. So they're not questioning whether or not physical separation is the cause. They are accepting that it is the cause. So this would not be the right answer. Checker spot butterflies in the 50-acre Jasper Ridge Preserve formed three groups that rarely interacted with each other. Is absolutely true. Did they talk about it in the paper though? No, it was part of the background for these two guys given in the second paragraph. So I'll hold on to the answer option. It is unlikely to be the right answer. While a factor, isolation was not as important to speciation as natural selection. Now notice the difference between A and C. In A, you're saying isolation is not a factor. In C, you're saying isolation was not as important as natural selection, which means natural selection is more important than isolation, which is the point that these two guys are trying to make. So we'll hold on to C. Definitely seems to be an option that works. Gene flow is less common and more erratic than Mayer and his colleagues claim. Are they saying that gene flow is less common? Yes, because they're saying it's not ubiquitous. Are they saying it is erratic? Erratic would suggest that it's random, that it's haphazard. You never know when gene flow is going to happen and when it's not going to happen, which is not the point that these two guys are saying. In fact, they're saying that it is affected by factors and there are reasons for it to happen, except that the factor is not separation, the factor is natural selection. So while they're saying one part of the option is true, gene flow is less common, they are not saying that gene flow is more erratic. So D does not make sense to me. I'm going to eliminate it. B is true, but not from the part of the passage that the question is referencing, which means the only option that you're pretty much left with is C. And that would be the right answer for the question. Moving on to question 2. All of the following statements are true according to the passage except. So we talked about except questions in last week's session as well. Don't go in looking for one answer option that is false. Find 3 options that are true and eliminate them. Then whatever that you're left with would be the right answer. So that's the better way of doing rather than going in and looking for a particular option. Gene flow contributes to evolutionary divergence. Are we saying that gene flow contributes to evolutionary divergence? Yes. We are only saying it's not the primary factor. So we are accepting this. It is stated in the passage, so it is true, which means we can go ahead and eliminate it. The population bomb questioned dominant ideas about species diversity. Now it suggests that you go back and look at the passage at where the population bomb is mentioned. Population bomb is mentioned in the second paragraph, first sentence, when introducing Paul Ehrlich. It says, in the mid-1960s, the biologist Paul Ehrlich, author of the population bomb, and his Stanford University colleague. What was the population bomb about? We do not know. We only know that it was written by Paul. And it's not the name of the 1969 paper that we are discussing, because the population bomb here in the bracket is 1968. So it's not the classic paper that they're talking about in the third paragraph. So what is this population bomb about? I have no idea. I only know that Paul wrote it. So I'm going to hold on to B. There's no mention in the passage whether it questioned or didn't question. So we'll see. Evolutionary changes unfold imperceptibly over time. That's the introduction to the whole passage, that it happens imperceptibly. Absolutely true. Checkerspot butterflies are known to exhibit speciation while living in close proximity. Speciation, as we talked, is the formation of a different species or creation of that diversity. And the whole point of the second para was to show that there were 3 different variations of the checkerspot butterflies within close proximity. So they exhibit speciation. That is also definitely true, which means the only possible answer here is B, mainly because the passage does not discuss population bomb at all. So we do not know what it did. Did Paul question dominant ideas about species diversity? Yes, the author did. Did he do it in this paper? We have no clue. That's not given in the passage. So these are the things that you have to be careful about when reading your answer options. It is very easy for you to say Paul Ehrlich is questioning dominant ideas about species diversity and associate it to this paper. But he need not have done it in this work. He could have done it in other works. And that is something you have to be super careful about. The last question on the passage. We'll discuss this and then I'll have a quick look at the chat and then see if you guys have asked any questions there. The author discusses Mayer, Ehrlich and Raven to demonstrate that. Now notice that he's mentioning all 3 of them, right? It is not just one side or 2 sides. Overall, it's about the discussion, right? So the answer option has to be something generic, something broad that talks about speciation in general and not necessarily about one point of view. It should not be specific to either natural selection or physical separation. Evolution is a sensitive and controversial topic. We are not talking about whether Kim Kardashian should have worn something or not for it to be a controversial or a sensitive topic. It's just a scientific debate that's happening. So be careful about the choice of words. Yes, are they debating it? Yes. Does that mean it's controversial? and sensitive, not necessarily. So be very careful about these words. Ehrlich and Raven's ideas about evolutionary divergence are widely accepted by scientists. Which one is more acceptable than the other one? We have not talked about it. We've only said the first guy, Mayer, came up with this theory, and then in the 1960s, these guys questioned it. Is now a third theory has the third theory now come up that people are widely accepting that has disproven all of these theories? We have no idea. So this is acceptance by scientists, right? That has not been discussed anywhere in the passage. The causes of speciation are debated by scientists. Yes, clearly, these guys are arguing about it. Checkerspot butterflies offer the best example of Ehrlich and Raven's ideation. It's just something that they did, not necessarily the best example. So be careful about the use of such superlatives as well. Just because a guy is doing something or saying something is good doesn't mean he's saying it's awesome and best. So be careful about that, which means best option that would work here is causes of speciation are debated by scientists. As I said, very broad, very generic answer option, which is typical in such questions because the question talks about all of the authors mentioned here. So it has to be a common thread to everyone. And when you are asking for a common thread in a debated topic, then saying they're debating or saying they're talking about evolution is pretty much the only thing that you can say.